The gavel fell with the finality of a gunshot, echoing through the sterile military courtroom as Captain Sarah Martinez sat motionless in her dress blues. The medals on her chest caught the harsh fluorescent light: Bronze Star, Purple Heart. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Combat Action Badge each one, a testament to valor that would soon be stripped away. In 3 hours, she would be dishonorably discharged, her 20-year career destroyed by charges she could have easily disproven. All she had to do was speak 3 words: Operation Night Raven. But those words would never leave her lips, even if it meant watching her life crumble in silence. The courtroom was packed with military personnel, their faces a mixture of confusion and disappointment. How had Captain Martinez, once considered one of the Army's most promising officers, fallen so far? The woman who had graduated top of her class from West Point, who had served with distinction in Iraq and Afghanistan, who had earned the respect of every soldier under her command, now sat accused of cowardice, dereliction of duty, and conduct unbecoming an officer. Major General Patricia Hawkins, the presiding judge, looked down at Sarah with what might have been regret. Captain Martinez, you have been found guilty on all charges. Before I pass sentence, do you have anything to say in your defense? Sarah stood slowly, her back straight despite the weight of defeat pressing down on her shoulders. Around her, the courtroom held its breath. This was her final chance to speak, to offer some explanation for the inexplicable actions that had led to this moment. Her lawyer, Colonel James Reed, leaned forward slightly, hoping against hope that his client would finally break her silence and provide the evidence that could save her career. "No, Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice steady and clear. "I have nothing to say." The collective exhale from the gallery was audible. Reporters scribbled frantically in their notebooks. Fellow officers shook their heads in disbelief. Sarah's younger sister Maria, who had flown in from California, buried her face in her hands. The woman they all thought they knew, the decorated war hero, the compassionate leader, the soldier's soldier, was choosing silence over salvation. What they didn't know was that Sarah Martinez had once been someone else entirely. 5 years ago, she had been Captain Sarah Phoenix Martinez, a name that existed only in the most classified files deep within the Pentagon. She had been part of a unit that didn't officially exist, conducting operations that had never happened, in places that weren't on any map. Operation Night Raven had been her final mission, a success so complete and so sensitive that its very existence was buried under layers of classification that would remain sealed for decades. But now, sitting in that courtroom, Sarah couldn't speak of phantom units or shadow operations. She couldn't mention the villages she had saved, the terrorist cells she had dismantled, or the American lives she had protected through actions that would forever remain invisible to history. The oath she had taken went deeper than military service. It was a blood oath to protect secrets that could topple governments and endanger countless lives. The charges against her stemmed from an incident 6 months earlier during a routine training exercise at Fort Carson. Sarah had been leading a battalion-level operation when she had suddenly ordered her troops to halt and take defensive positions. For 3 hours they had remained in place while Sarah maintained radio silence, ignoring increasingly frantic calls from higher command. When she finally gave the all-clear, the exercise had been deemed a failure, and Sarah had been unable to explain her actions without revealing that she had recognized the terrain from a previous Black Operations Mission 1 that had ended in catastrophic failure for another team. The investigation that followed had been thorough and relentless. Military investigators had combed through every aspect of Sarah's service record, looking for explanations that she couldn't provide. They had interviewed her subordinates, who described her as an exemplary officer who had never shown any signs of the cowardice and incompetence she was now accused of. They had examined her psychological evaluations, which showed no evidence of PTSD or any other condition that might explain her behavior. Lieutenant Colonel David Chun, Sarah's former executive officer, had testified on her behalf with passionate conviction. "Captain Martinez is the finest officer I've ever served with," he had said, his voice breaking slightly. "She saved my life in Kandahar, and I've seen her risk everything to protect her soldiers. Whatever happened during that exercise, there has to be an explanation. This isn't the woman I know." But Sarah had remained silent throughout the proceedings, her face an impassive mask that revealed nothing of the turmoil beneath. She had watched character witness after character witness testify to her integrity, her courage, and her unwavering dedication to duty. She had listened to her commanding officers express their bewilderment at her actions, their disappointment in someone they had considered one of their brightest stars. Master Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez, who had served under Sarah in Afghanistan, had been particularly emotional in his testimony. "Ma'am saved 23 soldiers that day in Helmand," he had said, his weathered face streaked with tears. "She went back into that building 3 times to get everyone out. I'd follow her anywhere, and I still would. There's something we're not being told here." He was right, of course. There was much they weren't being told, and Sarah would ensure it stayed that way. Even as her career burned around her, even as her reputation crumbled and her future dissolved, she would not break the sacred trust that had been placed in her. The men and women who had served alongside her in the shadows, who had risked everything for operations that would never be acknowledged, deserved her silence. As the court-martial proceedings had dragged on for weeks, Sarah had received visitors. In her temporary quarters, her parents had flown in from Texas, their faces etched with confusion and pain. Her father, a Vietnam veteran himself, had begged her to fight back, to defend herself against charges that seemed so completely at odds with the daughter he had raised. "Mia, you're throwing your life away," he had said in Spanish, the language of her childhood. "Whatever you're protecting, it can't be worth this." But Sarah had simply held his hand and said nothing. How could she explain that some secrets were worth any sacrifice? How could she tell him that her silence was itself a form of service, perhaps the most important service she would ever perform? The media had been relentless in their coverage of the case. The story of a decorated war hero's fall from grace had captured national attention, spawning countless articles and television segments. Military analysts had offered theories ranging from PTSD to some form of breakdown, but none had come close to the truth. Sarah Martinez had become a cautionary tale, a reminder of how even the most promising careers could end in disgrace. Now, as she stood before the judge awaiting her sentence, Sarah felt a strange sense of peace. She had made her choice, and she would live with the consequences. The uniform she wore would be taken from her, the medals would be returned, and the career she had built would be erased. But the secrets she protected would remain safe, and the lives that depended on that silence would continue. The real tragedy was that the world would never know the truth about Captain Sarah Martinez. They would never know about the night she had single-handedly eliminated a terrorist cell planning to attack a school in Somalia. They would never know about the intelligence she had gathered that had prevented a major attack on American soil. They would never know about the sacrifices she had made in the shadows, serving her country in ways that would never be acknowledged or rewarded. As the judge prepared to pronounce sentence, Sarah's mind drifted to her team from Operation Night. Raven, Jackson Ghost Morrison, Miguel Viper Santos, and Amanda Falcon Rivera, they were still out there, still serving in the shadows, still protecting secrets that could never be revealed. They understood her choice, even if no one else could. They knew that some oaths transcended rank, career, and even personal honor. The gavel was about to fall again, and with it, the final chapter of Captain Sarah Martinez's official military career. But the real story, the one that mattered, would remain classified. protected by the silence of a woman who had chosen honor over vindication, duty over self-preservation, and service over glory. 6 months earlier, the sun had beaten down mercilessly. On Fort Carson's training grounds, as Colonel Marcus Blackwood surveyed his domain with the satisfaction of a man who had built his reputation on unwavering discipline and traditional military values. At 52, Blackwood commanded the 4th Infantry Division's training operations with an iron fist wrapped in regulation leather gloves. His office walls were adorned with commendations spanning 3 decades of service, photographs with Pentagon officials, and a Bronze Star he had earned during the Gulf War. To his subordinates, he was the embodiment of military. Blackwood had built his career on the principle that modern warfare was becoming too soft, too accommodating to what he considered politically correct influences. He believed that the integration of women into combat roles had weakened the military's effectiveness, though he was careful to express these views only in private conversations with trusted colleagues. His public statements were always measured and professional, but those who knew him well understood his true feelings about the changing face of the armed forces. When Captain Sarah Martinez had been assigned to his command 6 months prior, Blackwood had reviewed her file with the grudging acknowledgement that her record was impressive. West Point graduate, multiple combat deployments, decorated veteran on paper, she was everything a commanding officer could want. But something about her troubled him, a quality he couldn't quite identify, but instinctively distrusted. She was too composed, too confident, too comfortable with authority for someone her age and rank. During their first meeting, Sarah had entered his office with the crisp precision expected of a career officer. But Blackwood had sensed something else beneath the surface. Her eyes held a depth that seemed inappropriate for someone who had supposedly spent her entire career in conventional units. When she spoke, her voice carried an authority that didn't match her relatively junior rank. Most disturbing of all, she had an unsettling habit of pausing before answering questions, as if she were carefully considering which version of the truth to reveal. "Captain Martinez," Blackwood had said during that initial briefing, "I expect my officers to be transparent, decisive, and completely committed to the mission. I don't tolerate hesitation, second-guessing, or any behavior that might undermine unit cohesion. Is that understood?" Sarah had nodded crisply. "Perfectly clear, sir." But even as she had spoken the words, Blackwood had noticed that slight pause, that momentary calculation that suggested she was holding something back. It was a quality he had learned to recognize during his years in command, the sign of an officer who had secrets. Over the following weeks, Blackwood had watched Sarah's performance with growing suspicion. She was undeniably competent, perhaps even exceptional, but there was something about her tactical thinking that bothered him. During planning sessions, she would sometimes suggest approaches that were unconventional, even brilliant, but that she couldn't adequately explain when pressed for details. When other officers discussed their previous assignments, Sarah would listen intently but contribute little about her own experiences. The breaking point had come during a joint training exercise with Special Forces units. Sarah had been observing from the command post when she had suddenly become agitated, her composed demeanor cracking for just a moment. She had stepped outside to make a phone call, speaking in hushed tones to someone whose identity she had refused to reveal. When she returned, she had seemed distracted, preoccupied with something that had nothing to do with the exercise at hand. "Captain, is there something about this operation that concerns you?" Blackwood had asked. Sarah had met his gaze steadily. "No, sir. Everything appears to be proceeding according to plan." But Blackwood had seen the lie in her eyes, the careful construction of her response. She was hiding something, and he was determined to find out what it was. His investigation had begun subtly. He had requested Sarah's complete personnel file, studying every assignment, every commendation, every evaluation. What he found was impressive but strangely incomplete. There were gaps in her service record months at a time when her assignments were listed only as special duty or temporary assignment. Her medical records showed treatment for injuries that were inconsistent with the operations she had supposedly been involved in. Most telling of all, several of her fitness reports had been signed by officers whose names didn't appear in any official military directory. Blackwood had made discreet inquiries through his network of contacts, but the responses had been frustrating and inconclusive. Some officers claimed never to have heard of Captain Martinez, despite records showing they had served together. Others would change the subject when her name came up, their faces taking on the guarded expression of people who had been instructed to say nothing. The more Blackwood investigated, the more convinced he became that Sarah Martinez was not what she appeared to be. Her tactical knowledge was too advanced, her situational awareness too acute, her composure under pressure too perfect. She moved through the world with the confidence of someone who had faced far greater challenges than anything a conventional military career could provide. His suspicions had crystallized during a staff meeting when they had been discussing a hypothetical scenario involving hostage rescue operations. Sarah had begun to offer suggestions with startling specificity, describing tactics and procedures that were not part of standard military doctrine. When Blackwood had asked where she had learned such techniques, she had simply said they were theoretical considerations she had studied during her officer training. But Blackwood knew better. The level of detail, the casual way she discussed highly specialized procedures, the subtle corrections she made to other officers' assumptions, it all pointed to direct, hands-on experience with operations that didn't exist in the conventional military. The colonel had begun to view Sarah as a potential threat to his command. If she was indeed involved in classified operations, her presence in his unit could be compromising security protocols he wasn't even aware of. More troubling still was the possibility that she was gathering intelligence on his operations, reporting back to handlers whose identities and objectives remained unknown. His paranoia had grown with each passing week. He had begun to notice how other officers deferred to Sarah's judgment, despite her relatively junior rank. He had observed the way enlisted personnel seemed to trust her implicitly, as if they sensed something in her that commanded respect. Most disturbing of all, he had caught her several times studying satellite imagery and intelligence reports that were well above her clearance level. Though she had always claimed to be reviewing them for legitimate training purposes, Blackwood had started to document every interaction with Sarah, building a case that something was seriously wrong with her presence in his command. He had noted her unusual travel patterns, her tendency to receive encrypted communications at odd hours, and her habit of disappearing for brief periods without adequate explanation. The colonel's worldview was built on clear hierarchies, defined roles, and absolute transparency within the chain of command. Sarah Martinez represented everything he opposed: secrets, ambiguity, and the suggestion that there were aspects of military service that existed outside his understanding and control. In his mind, she had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the modern military, a reminder that the institution he had dedicated his life to was changing in ways that made him increasingly uncomfortable. When the opportunity had finally presented itself during that fateful training exercise, Blackwood had been ready. He had positioned himself to observe Sarah's every move, prepared to document any behavior that might justify his growing suspicions. What he had witnessed that day had exceeded even his darkest expectations, providing him with the ammunition he needed to finally remove this enigmatic officer from his command. The irony was that Blackwood genuinely believed he was protecting his unit and upholding military values. He saw himself as a guardian of tradition, a defender of proper protocol, and a protector of the institutional integrity that had defined his career. He couldn't have known that his actions would destroy the career of someone who had sacrificed more for her country than he could ever imagine. The pattern began almost immediately after Colonel Blackwood's initial suspicions took root. During morning briefings, he would pose questions to Sarah that seemed designed more to trap than to inform. His inquiries about her previous assignments became increasingly pointed, delivered with the practiced precision of an interrogator rather than a commanding officer seeking routine information. Other staff members began to notice the subtle shift in dynamics. The way Blackwood's voice would take on a harder edge when addressing Captain Martinez. "Captain, your tactical assessment of yesterday's exercise seems unusually sophisticated," Blackwood would say, his tone carefully neutral, but his eyes sharp with scrutiny. "Where exactly did you develop such expertise in urban warfare scenarios?" Sarah would respond with textbook professionalism, citing standard training manuals and conventional wisdom, but her answers only seemed to deepen Blackwood's suspicions. The more ordinary her explanations, the more convinced he became that she was hiding something extraordinary. The whisper campaign started in the officers' mess hall. Blackwood never directly criticized Sarah, but his carefully placed comments created an atmosphere of doubt that spread through the command structure like a slow-acting poison. He would mention her unusual background in conversations with other senior officers, or express concerns about security protocols when discussing her assignments. The implications were never stated outright, but they didn't need to be. Major Robert Sterling, Blackwood's deputy commander, had initially been impressed by Sarah's competence and professionalism. But as the weeks passed, he found himself viewing her through the lens of his colonel's suspicions. During planning sessions, he began to notice things that had previously seemed unremarkable. The way Sarah would sometimes finish tactical assessments with information that seemed to come from nowhere, or how she would occasionally use terminology that wasn't part of standard military vocabulary. "There's something about Martinez that doesn't add up," Sterling confided to Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes during a private conversation. "The colonel's got concerns about her background, and honestly, I'm starting to see what he means." The isolation was gradual but systematic. Sarah found herself excluded from informal gatherings, her suggestions met with polite but dismissive responses, her presence treated as somehow problematic. Officers who had previously sought her input began to avoid her, their behavior shifting from collegial respect to professional distance. Captain Michael Thompson, who had served with Sarah on several training exercises, noticed the change immediately. "It's like she's become radioactive," he told his wife one evening. "Nobody wants to be seen talking to her anymore." The colonels made it clear that association with Martinez isn't career-enhancing. But Thompson also noticed something else. Sarah's response to the growing ostracism was completely professional. She never complained, never defended herself, never showed any sign that she was aware of the campaign being waged against her. She continued to perform her duties with the same quiet competence that had initially impressed everyone, but now, that very composure was being interpreted as evidence of guilt. The administrative harassment escalated week by week. Sarah's reports would be returned with demands for unnecessary revisions. Her leave requests would be delayed or denied for bureaucratic reasons that seemed to apply only to her. Training schedules would be changed without proper notification, leaving her scrambling to maintain her professional responsibilities. While navigating an increasingly hostile environment, Blackwood's genius lay in his ability to make the persecution appear routine. Every action he took was technically within regulations. Every criticism was couched in terms of maintaining standards. Every slight was delivered with the appearance of military professionalism. To an outside observer, he was simply a demanding, commanding officer holding his people to high standards. First Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh, one of the few officers who continued to interact normally with Sarah, began to document what she was witnessing. "They're trying to break her," she wrote in her personal journal. "The colonel's turned half the command structure against her, and she's not even fighting back. She just takes it all with that same calm expression, like she's protecting something more important than her career." The psychological pressure was relentless. Sarah would arrive at briefings to find that her chair had been moved or removed entirely. Her parking space would be reassigned without notification. Her office supplies would disappear, forcing her to make repeated requests for basic necessities. Each incident was minor enough to seem petty if complained about, but collectively, they created an atmosphere of constant stress and uncertainty. Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, who worked closely with Sarah on logistics coordination, watched the systematic isolation with growing anger. "Ma'am doesn't deserve this," she told her husband, a veteran himself. "She's the best officer I've ever worked with, and they're treating her like a criminal. Whatever they think she's done, they're wrong." But Gonzalez also noticed something that troubled her deeply: Sarah's absolute refusal to defend herself. When other officers would make snide comments within earshot, Sarah would simply continue working. When her competence was questioned in meetings, she would provide factual responses without any trace of indignation. It was as if she had accepted the persecution as a price she was willing to pay for something else entirely. The campaign of professional sabotage reached new heights during a major training exercise with visiting Pentagon officials. Blackwood had arranged for Sarah to be assigned to a role that was virtually guaranteed to result in failure, coordinating logistics for an operation that had been deliberately under-resourced and overcomplicated. The setup was so obvious that several junior officers expressed private concerns about the fairness of the assignment. "This is a career killer," Major Sterling had warned Blackwood. "If she fails at this, it'll be grounds for serious disciplinary action." Blackwood's response had been coldly professional. Then perhaps she should have been more transparent about her qualifications and background. "This assignment will test whether she's truly capable of the responsibility she's been given." But Sarah had surprised everyone by succeeding brilliantly, improvising solutions that transformed potential disaster into tactical victory. Her performance had been so outstanding that even the visiting Pentagon officials had commented on her exceptional leadership and problem-solving abilities. The success should have vindicated her competence and ended the unofficial campaign against her. Instead, it had the opposite effect. Blackwood's paranoia deepened, convinced that her success was evidence of training and experience that she couldn't possibly have obtained through conventional military channels. Her very competence became proof of her deception. The other officers began to distance themselves even further, interpreting her success as confirmation that she was indeed hiding something significant. The better she performed, the more suspicious her colleagues became. It was a no-win situation that would have broken most officers, but Sarah continued to serve with the same quiet dignity that had characterized her entire career. Lieutenant Colonel David Chun, who had recently been assigned to the base, observed the situation with growing concern. As a veteran of multiple combat deployments, he recognized the signs of a good soldier being systematically destroyed by institutional politics. But he also sensed something familiar about Sarah's bearing, something that reminded him of operators he had worked with in classified environments. "There's more to this story than anyone's saying," Chun told his wife during a secure phone call. "Martinez is either the most professionally composed officer I've ever met, or she's protecting something that's bigger than her career. Either way, what's happening to her is wrong." The isolation had become so complete that Sarah was essentially functioning as a pariah within her own command. Officers who had once respected her now avoided eye contact. Enlisted personnel who had admired her leadership now seemed uncertain about how to interact with her. The very competence that had once made her a valued member of the team now marked her as different, suspicious, and potentially dangerous. Yet through it all, Sarah maintained her silence and her dignity, as if she understood that the persecution was temporary but the secrets she protected were eternal. She had made her choice long ago, and no amount of professional harassment would shake her resolve. The harassment intensified as autumn settled over Fort Carson, bringing with it a chill that seemed to permeate more than just the mountain air. Colonel Blackwood's campaign against Sarah had evolved from subtle undermining to overt aggression, each action carefully calculated to push her toward a breaking point that never seemed to come. His frustration with her unshakable composure had transformed into something approaching obsession, a need to crack the facade of professional competence that she maintained. Regardless of the pressure applied, the psychological warfare took on increasingly personal dimensions. Blackwood began scheduling mandatory meetings during times when Sarah had requested personal leave, forcing her to choose between family obligations and military duties. When she attended her younger brother's wedding via video call, he arranged for an urgent training exercise that required her immediate presence, knowing she would comply without complaint. Her stoic acceptance of these deliberate provocations only fueled his determination to find her breaking point. During a particularly brutal week in November, Blackwood implemented what he privately called stress testing. Sarah's daily schedule was restructured to include back-to-back meetings with conflicting requirements, reports that needed to be completed in impossibly short time frames, and assignments that required her to be in multiple locations simultaneously. The obvious impossibility of meeting these demands should have prompted any reasonable officer to request clarification or file a formal complaint. Sarah did neither. Instead, she somehow managed to fulfill every requirement, often working through the night to complete assignments that would have challenged entire teams. Her success in meeting impossible deadlines only deepened Blackwood's conviction that she possessed capabilities that extended far beyond normal military training. Her very competence had become evidence of her deception. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Major Sterling, who had initially supported Blackwood's suspicions, began to express private concerns about the escalating campaign. "Sir, with respect, we might be crossing some lines here," he told his colonel during a closed-door meeting. "Martinez hasn't violated any regulations, and some of the assignments we're giving her are starting to look like harassment." Blackwood's response was swift and decisive. "Major, if you're not comfortable with maintaining proper standards and security protocols, perhaps you need to reconsider your fitness for command." Captain Martinez's ability to handle challenging assignments is precisely what makes her suspicious. Normal officers struggle with normal tasks. She's excelling at impossible ones. The colonel's paranoia had reached the point where Sarah's every strength was interpreted as evidence of her guilt. Her physical fitness was too exceptional, suggesting special operations training. Her tactical knowledge was too comprehensive, implying classified briefings. Her emotional control was too perfect, indicating psychological conditioning beyond standard military preparation. The persecution extended beyond professional duties into every aspect of Sarah's military life. Her quarters were subjected to surprise inspections that occurred with suspicious frequency, often conducted when she was off duty and forced to return immediately. Her personal communications were monitored more closely than regulations typically allowed, with Blackwood citing security concerns that he never fully specified. Captain Jennifer Walsh, one of the few officers who still interacted normally with Sarah, was summoned to Blackwood's office for what he termed a professional development conversation. The meeting was ostensibly about Walsh's career advancement, but the underlying message was clear. Continued association with Captain Martinez would not be beneficial to her future prospects. "I notice you've been spending considerable time with Captain Martinez," Blackwood said, his tone carefully neutral. "While I appreciate loyalty among officers, I hope you understand that professional relationships must sometimes be balanced against broader unit cohesion and security considerations." Walsh left the meeting understanding that her career was being held hostage to her willingness to isolate Sarah. Within days, even she had begun to limit her interactions with the increasingly isolated captain, adding another layer to Sarah's professional loneliness. The enlisted personnel who worked directly with Sarah found themselves caught in an impossible situation. Their direct experience with her leadership was overwhelmingly positive. She was fair, competent, and genuinely concerned about their welfare. But the signals from senior leadership were unmistakable. Supporting Captain Martinez was a career-limiting move. Sergeant First Class Robert Hayes, who had served under Sarah in several training exercises, was called into his first sergeant's office for what was described as a mentorship conversation. The discussion quickly focused on Hayes's working relationship with Captain Martinez and his observations about her behavior and competence. "Look, Sergeant Hayes," First Sergeant Williams said, "I'm not asking you to say anything negative about Captain Martinez. But if you've noticed anything unusual about her methods, her knowledge, or her contacts, it would be in everyone's best interest to document those observations." Hayes understood the implicit threat. He was being asked to spy on an officer he respected, to find evidence that could be used against her. His refusal to cooperate was noted in his file, and he soon found himself assigned to duties that kept him away from Sarah's area of responsibility. The social isolation became complete when Blackwood implemented what he called security protocols that effectively prevented Sarah from accessing certain areas of the base, attending specific meetings, or reviewing particular documents. Each restriction was justified by vague references to operational security and need-to-know requirements that seemed to apply only to her. Sarah's response to the escalating persecution remained unnaturally calm. She submitted to each new restriction without complaint, fulfilled every impossible assignment without protest, and maintained her professional demeanor regardless of the personal cost. Her silence had become legendary among the base personnel, who watched her endure treatment that would have broken most officers. Lieutenant Colonel Chun, who had been quietly observing the situation, began to document what he was witnessing. His military experience told him that Sarah's behavior was either evidence of exceptional character or professional training that extended far beyond conventional military service. Either way, the systematic persecution she was enduring violated every principle of military leadership he had learned in his career. The breaking point Blackwood had been engineering finally came during the joint training exercise with Special Operations units. Sarah's assignment was to coordinate logistics for a complex operation that would test her abilities under maximum stress. Unknown to her, Blackwood had arranged for the exercise to include scenarios that would trigger any officer with classified operational experience. The stage was set for Sarah's final test situation, designed to force her to choose between maintaining her cover and fulfilling her military duties. Blackwood was convinced that she would finally reveal her true nature, providing him with the evidence he needed to justify months of systematic harassment. What he couldn't have anticipated was that Sarah had already made her choice long ago. The secrets she protected were worth more than her career, more than her reputation, and more than the respect of her colleagues. She had accepted the persecution as the price of her silence, and no amount of professional torture would change her resolve. The exercise that was meant to break her would instead demonstrate the true extent of her sacrifice, revealing not her guilt but her extraordinary commitment to duties that transcended military rank and personal ambition. Blackwood's obsession with uncovering her secrets was about to collide with her absolute determination to protect them, setting the stage for a confrontation that would destroy one of their careers forever. The emergency klaxon pierced the pre-dawn darkness of Fort Carson on November 15th, jolting the entire base into high alert. What had begun as a routine joint training exercise with the 75th Ranger Regiment had suddenly transformed into something far more dangerous. Intelligence reports were flooding in about a potential terrorist cell that had infiltrated the surrounding area, armed with stolen military equipment and detailed knowledge of the base's security protocols. The exercise had become a real-world crisis, and every available officer was being mobilized for what could become an actual combat operation on American soil. Colonel Blackwood stood in the command center, his face grim as he received updates from multiple intelligence sources. The situation was unprecedented. A coordinated attack was being planned against Fort Carson itself, with the terrorists using the cover of the training exercise to position themselves for maximum impact. The threat was immediate, sophisticated, and required tactical expertise that pushed the limits of conventional military planning. "We need all hands on this," Blackwood announced to his assembled staff. "This isn't a drill anymore. We have credible intelligence that suggests multiple hostiles are positioned in the mountain terrain surrounding the base, armed with advanced weaponry and explosives. Their target appears to be the ammunition depot and the visiting dignitaries." From the Pentagon, the tactical situation was nightmarish in its complexity. The terrorists had chosen their timing perfectly, striking during a period when the base was hosting high-ranking officials and conducting training exercises that had scattered personnel across multiple locations. The attack required a coordinated response that would test every aspect of the command structure's capabilities. Sarah Martinez stood in the briefing room, listening to the intelligence reports with the same composed attention she brought to every military situation. But something about the operational parameters being described triggered memories she had spent years trying to suppress. The tactics being employed, the timing of the attack, the specific weapons mentioned in the intelligence briefings, all of it was unnervingly familiar. As the briefing continued, Sarah found herself unconsciously analyzing the situation with expertise that went far beyond her official training. The terrorist cell's positioning suggested knowledge of special operations techniques. Their choice of weapons indicated access to military-grade equipment that shouldn't have been available to civilian hostiles. Most troubling of all, their timing coincided with intelligence gathering that would have required insider knowledge of the base's security protocols. "Captain Martinez," Blackwood's voice cut through her analysis, "you'll be coordinating logistics for the perimeter defense. I want you to establish supply lines and communication networks that can support extended operations in mountainous terrain." The assignment should have been routine for an officer of Sarah's experience, but the specific requirements Blackwood was outlining triggered something deeper than professional competence. The tactical challenges he was describing: mountain warfare, coordinated defense against asymmetric threats, logistic support for special operations, were scenarios she had encountered before, in places and circumstances that officially didn't exist. As Sarah began to organize the logistical response, she noticed details that others seemed to miss. The intelligence reports mentioned specific types of explosives that were typically used in classified operations. The terrorists' communication protocols showed sophistication that suggested professional military training. Most significantly, their positioning in the mountain terrain was identical to approaches that had been used in a classified operation she had participated in 5 years earlier. Realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The attack wasn't random, it was specifically designed to exploit vulnerabilities that only someone with intimate knowledge of special operations procedures would understand. The terrorists weren't just using military tactics. They were using techniques that had been developed for the most classified missions, operations that existed only in the deepest levels of Pentagon secrecy. Sarah's mind raced as she connected the implications. If the attackers had access to classified operational procedures, they either had inside help or were themselves former special operations personnel. Either possibility meant that conventional military responses would be inadequate, potentially catastrophic. The base's defenders were preparing for a standard terrorist attack, but they were actually facing opponents who understood their procedures, their weaknesses, and their likely responses. The ethical dilemma that had been building for months suddenly crystallized into a moment of impossible choice. Sarah could continue her silence, maintain her cover, and watch as her colleagues walked into a trap that would likely result in massive casualties. Or she could reveal knowledge that would expose her true background, destroy her carefully constructed anonymity, and potentially compromise operations that were still ongoing around the world. Standing in the command center, surrounded by officers who had been systematically isolating her for months, Sarah faced the defining moment of her career. The intelligence briefings continued around her, but she was no longer listening to the official reports. Instead, she was processing the tactical situation through the lens of experience that officially didn't exist, analyzing threats that her colleagues couldn't fully comprehend. The base's defensive preparations were being organized according to standard protocols, but Sarah could see the flaws in their approach. The positioning of defensive units left gaps that the attackers would exploit. The communication systems being deployed were vulnerable to the specific types of electronic warfare that the intelligence reports suggested the terrorists possessed. Most critically, the evacuation procedures for the visiting dignitaries were following patterns that could be predicted by anyone with access to special operations training manuals. Lieutenant Colonel Chun, who had been watching Sarah's reaction to the briefings, noticed the subtle change in her demeanor. Her usual composed professionalism had been replaced by something more intense, more focused. She was analyzing the situation with a level of expertise that seemed to come from direct experience rather than theoretical training. Captain Martinez seems to have some insights about mountain warfare tactics, Chun observed to Major Sterling. Her analysis of the tactical situation is remarkably sophisticated. Sterling nodded, but his response was colored by months of suspicion. That's exactly what concerns me about her. How does a logistics officer know so much about counter-terrorism operations? The question hung in the air as Sarah continued her preparations, unaware that her every movement was being scrutinized for evidence of the very expertise she was trying to conceal. The crisis was forcing her to draw upon knowledge that she had sworn to keep secret, creating a paper trail of competence that would be impossible to explain through conventional military experience. As the situation reports continued to flow, Sarah realized that the window for effective response was rapidly closing. The terrorists' timing had been calculated to coincide with the precise moment when the base's defenses would be most vulnerable, when personnel would be scattered and confused, when standard procedures would be inadequate to meet the threat. Weight of her knowledge pressed down on her like a physical burden. She could see the tactical solutions that would save lives, prevent catastrophe, and neutralize the threat. But implementing those solutions would require her to demonstrate expertise that officially didn't exist, to reveal capabilities that would immediately expose her true background. Standing at the crossroads between duty and secrecy, Sarah Martinez faced the choice that would define not just her career, but her entire future. The oath she had taken to protect classified information was colliding with her deeper oath to protect American lives. In the next few hours, she would have to decide which commitment was more sacred, which sacrifice was more important, and which price she was willing to pay for the choices she had made years earlier in the shadows of operations that never officially happened. The command center buzzed with urgent activity as Sarah found herself positioned at the tactical communications station, her hands moving across the equipment with practiced efficiency that she tried to disguise as routine competence. The intelligence updates were becoming increasingly dire. The terrorist cell had been identified as a highly trained unit, with access to military-grade equipment and detailed knowledge of Fort Carson's defensive capabilities. What should have been a manageable security threat was evolving into a potential massacre. Colonel Blackwood paced behind the command staff, his anxiety evident as he struggled to coordinate a response to a threat that exceeded his operational experience. The visiting Pentagon officials had been moved to a secure location, but their safety depended on the base's ability to neutralize hostiles who seemed to anticipate every defensive move. The standard protocols that Blackwood had relied on throughout his career were proving inadequate against opponents who understood those protocols intimately. The perimeter teams are reporting movement in sectors 7 and 12, Major Sterling announced, his voice tight with tension. But the hostiles are using communication jamming that's disrupting our coordination. We're operating blind in critical areas. Sarah's hands stilled on the communication controls as she processed the tactical implications. The jamming techniques being described weren't standard terrorist tactics. They were sophisticated electronic warfare methods that required specialized training and equipment. Her mind automatically began calculating countermeasures, drawing from experience that she couldn't officially possess. "Sir," she said quietly, her voice carefully controlled, "I might be able to suggest some alternative communication protocols that could work around the jamming." Blackwood turned to her with a mixture of desperation and suspicion. "What kind of alternatives, Captain?" Sarah hesitated, knowing that any detailed response would reveal knowledge that went far beyond her official qualifications. "Frequency hopping techniques and burst transmission methods that are less commonly known." The pause before her last words was deliberate, a careful construction that acknowledged the classified nature of her knowledge without explicitly stating it. But Lieutenant Colonel Chun, who had been monitoring the exchange, caught the subtle implications immediately. As Sarah began implementing communication protocols that restored contact with the scattered perimeter teams, her movements became more fluid, more confident. The careful mask of ordinary competence slipped slightly, revealing reflexes and knowledge that came from practical experience rather than textbook training. Her fingers found shortcuts on the equipment that most operators never discovered, and her tactical suggestions carried the weight of someone who had faced similar situations before. "How did you know about those frequency settings?" Sergeant Morrison asked, his voice filled with genuine curiosity and growing respect. "I've been working communications for 8 years, and I've never seen those protocols." Sarah's response was carefully neutral. "I've studied unconventional warfare techniques in my spare time. Military history and tactical evolution are personal interests." But even as she spoke, she was making adjustments to the communication array that went beyond theoretical knowledge. Her hands moved with the muscle memory of someone who had operated similar equipment under combat conditions, who had used these exact techniques to coordinate operations in hostile territory. The tactical situation continued to deteriorate despite the improved communications. The terrorist cell was demonstrating a level of coordination and tactical sophistication that suggested professional military training. Their positioning in the mountain terrain exploited weaknesses in Fort Carson's defensive layout that shouldn't have been apparent to civilian attackers. "They're using leapfrogging advancement techniques," Sarah observed, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to surprise even her. "It's a special operations tactic designed to maintain continuous pressure while minimizing exposure to defensive fire." Major Sterling looked at her sharply. "How do you know about special operations tactics?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Sarah realized that her analysis had been too specific, too detailed, too clearly based on direct experience. She had allowed her concern for the tactical situation to override her commitment to maintaining her cover. "I've studied asymmetric warfare extensively," she replied, but her voice lacked the conviction of her earlier explanations. "The techniques they're using are documented in various military journals and case studies." Colonel Blackwood moved closer, his suspicions crystallizing into near certainty. "Captain, your knowledge of these tactics seems remarkably detailed for someone whose experience is limited to conventional units." Sarah met his gaze steadily, understanding that she was approaching the point of no return. Every word she spoke, every tactical insight she offered, was building a case against her carefully constructed cover. But the alternative, remaining silent while her colleagues walked into a trap, was becoming impossible to accept. The breakthrough came when Sarah intercepted a fragment of the terrorists' communications that had broken through their jamming protocols. What she heard made her blood run cold. They were discussing specific operational procedures that had been developed for classified missions. using terminology that existed only in the deepest levels of Pentagon secrecy. "Colonel," she said, her voice carrying an urgency that cut through the command center's background noise, "we need to evacuate the ammunition depot immediately. They're planning to use it as a secondary explosion to cover their extraction route." Blackwood stared at her. "How could you possibly know that from a 30-second radio intercept?" Sarah realized that she had reached the moment of impossible choice. The terrorists' tactical plan was becoming clear to her because she recognized the operational framework they were using, a framework that had been developed for missions that officially didn't exist. Her knowledge of their intentions came from intimate familiarity with classified procedures that she had sworn never to reveal. "I recognize the tactical pattern," she said quietly. "It's consistent with certain specialized operational procedures." The euphemism fooled no one. Lieutenant Colonel Chun stepped forward, his expression serious but not hostile. "Captain Martinez, I think it's time for you to tell us exactly what kind of specialized procedures you're familiar with." Sarah looked around the command center, seeing the faces of officers who had spent months viewing her with suspicion and distrust. They were about to learn that their suspicions had been justified, but not in the way they had imagined. She wasn't a security threat. She was a classified asset whose very existence was a state secret. "I can't discuss my background without proper authorization," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. "But I can tell you that the hostiles are using tactical procedures that are known only to a very small number of people, all of whom have the highest levels of security clearance." The implication was clear, and the silence that followed was deafening. Sarah Martinez, the logistics officer who had endured months of harassment and isolation, was revealing herself to be someone entirely different from what her personnel file suggested. Colonel Blackwood's face went pale as the full implications hit him. "Are you saying that you have direct knowledge of classified operational procedures?" Sarah nodded slowly, understanding that her answer would change everything. "Yes, sir, I do." The admission hung in the air like a confession, but it was also a revelation. The woman they had dismissed as suspicious was actually someone whose knowledge could save lives, whose expertise was exactly what they needed to counter the threat they faced. But even as she prepared to reveal enough of her background to help coordinate the defense, Sarah knew that her career as Captain Martinez was over. The secrets she had protected for 5 years were about to be exposed, and the consequences would extend far beyond Fort Carson. The silence in the command center stretched like a taut wire, every officer processing the implications of Sarah's admission. Colonel Blackwood's face cycled through confusion, anger, and a dawning recognition that he had been systematically persecuting someone whose true identity was far beyond his security clearance to know. The tactical displays continued their urgent updates around them, but for a moment, the crisis outside seemed secondary to the revelation unfolding within the command post. "Captain Martinez," Lieutenant Colonel Chun said carefully, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the gravity of classified operations, "I need you to be very specific about what you're telling us. Lives depend on accurate information." Sarah stood at the communications console, her hands still positioned over controls that she had been operating with expertise that shouldn't have existed. The decision to reveal her background had been made, but the extent of that revelation remained under her control. She could provide just enough information to help coordinate the defense, or she could fully expose the truth about her identity and risk compromising operations that were still ongoing around the world. "My name is Captain Sarah Martinez," she began, her voice steady but carrying undertones of resignation. "But for 7 years, I was known by a different designation. I was Phoenix 7, Special Activities Division, operating under the Defense Clandestine Service. My last official mission was Operation Night Raven, concluded 18 months ago." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread through the assembled officers. Major Sterling's mouth opened slightly, his years of suspicion suddenly recontextualized into a far more complex reality. The Special Activities Division was legendary within military intelligence circles. Operatives who existed in the deepest shadows of American national security, conducting missions that were so classified that even their existence was compartmentalized. "Jesus Christ," whispered Sergeant Morrison, his voice barely audible. "You're sad?" Sarah nodded, understanding that the abbreviation carried weight that her full rank and title never could. Special Activities Division operatives were the military's most elite covert assets, individuals who had been selected for psychological resilience, tactical brilliance, and absolute loyalty to classified objectives. They were the people who handled situations that conventional military units couldn't address, operating in environments where failure meant death and success meant eternal anonymity. Colonel Blackwood's face had gone ashen as he processed the magnitude of his mistake. For months, he had been harassing and investigating someone whose security clearance was several levels above his own, whose operational experience dwarfed his conventional military background. The woman he had dismissed as suspicious was actually one of the most highly trained and trusted operatives in the American intelligence community. "The hostiles outside," Sarah continued, her voice taking on the authority of someone accustomed to briefing at the highest levels of government, "are using tactical procedures that were developed for Operation Nightfall, a classified mission that was compromised 3 years ago. The techniques they're employing suggest that at least one member of their team has direct experience with SAD operational protocols." The implication was staggering. They weren't facing ordinary terrorists. They were confronting former American operatives who had either been turned or had gone rogue, using classified American tactics against an American military installation. The sophistication of their attack, their detailed knowledge of Fort Carson's defenses, their access to specialized equipment, all of it suddenly made sense. How many people would have had access to those protocols? Chun asked, his tactical mind immediately focusing on the operational implications. Sarah's expression darkened. Operation Nightfall involved a 12-person team. 4 were killed during the mission. 3 others died in separate operations over the following 2 years. That leaves 5 people who would have intimate knowledge of the tactical procedures being used today. She paused, her mind racing through classified personnel files that she had memorized years earlier. 2 of those 5 are still active in classified operations. 1 is in federal prison for unrelated charges. That leaves 2 individuals who are unaccounted for. The mathematics of betrayal were stark and terrifying. Somewhere in the mountain terrain surrounding Fort Carson, former American operatives were using their training and knowledge to orchestrate an attack against their former colleagues. The situation had evolved from a terrorist threat into something far more personal and dangerous. "I need to make a secure call," Sarah said, reaching for the classified communication system. "There are protocols for situations like this, procedures that can help us identify exactly who we're dealing with and what their objectives might be." But as she began to access the secure communication array, alarms began blaring throughout the command center. The tactical displays showed new movement in multiple sectors, coordinated advances that suggested the hostiles were beginning their final assault. The time for careful analysis and strategic planning had run out. "They're moving on the ammunition depot," Major Sterling announced, his voice tight with urgency. "Multiple teams, approaching from vectors that avoid our primary defensive positions." Sarah's training took over completely, her years of covert operations experience overriding months of careful concealment. She moved to the tactical display with fluid confidence, her fingers tracing attack routes with the certainty of someone who had planned similar operations from the other side. "They're using a modified version of the Gibraltar Protocol," she said, her voice carrying the authority of absolute expertise. It's designed to create the impression of a larger force while concentrating actual attack power on a single objective. The ammunition depot isn't their real target, it's a diversion. Colonel Blackwood stared at her, his mind struggling to process the transformation. The quiet, composed officer who had endured months of his harassment was revealing herself to be someone whose tactical knowledge exceeded his own by orders of magnitude. Her analysis of the enemy's intentions was delivered with the confidence of someone who had executed similar operations herself. "What's their real objective?" Chun asked, his respect for Sarah's expertise now explicit and unquestioned. Sarah studied the tactical display, her mind processing the attack patterns through the lens of operational experience that she had never been able to acknowledge. The enemy's positioning, their timing, their diversionary tactics, all of it formed a pattern that was familiar because she had helped develop similar strategies during her years in the shadows. "The visiting Pentagon officials," she said with sudden certainty. "They're not trying to destroy the base. They're trying to capture or eliminate specific high-value targets. The ammunition depot assault is designed to draw our defensive forces away from the secure facility where the officials are being held." The revelation transformed the entire tactical situation. What had appeared to be a terrorist attack was actually a precision assassination or kidnapping operation, executed by former American operatives who understood exactly how the base's defensive protocols would respond to apparent threats. "We need to redeploy immediately," Sarah continued, her voice carrying the urgency of someone who understood the full implications of the enemy's strategy. "Every minute we spend defending the ammunition depot is a minute they're getting closer to their real objectives." But even as she spoke, Sarah knew that revealing her expertise had consequences that extended far beyond the current crisis. Her cover was blown, her carefully constructed anonymity destroyed. The woman who had chosen silence over vindication was now forced to use her voice to save lives, even though that voice would inevitably lead to questions she couldn't answer and investigations she couldn't survive. The ghost of Operation Night Raven was about to become visible again, and the light she cast would illuminate secrets that were meant to remain forever in the shadows. The tactical redeployment Sarah had recommended was already underway when the first explosion rocked the base, sending tremors through the command center and confirming her analysis with devastating accuracy. The ammunition depot had been hit, but the blast was smaller than expected, a controlled detonation designed to create chaos rather than maximum destruction. Through the reinforced windows they could see the orange glow of flames rising into the night sky, drawing defensive units exactly where the attackers wanted them. "All units, this is command," Colonel Blackwood spoke into his headset, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "Redirect Alpha and Bravo companies to the secure facility. Repeat, the ammunition depot is a diversion. Primary threat is to VIP protection detail." Sarah moved to the intelligence console, her fingers flying across the keyboard with the practiced efficiency of someone who had operated similar systems in far more dangerous environments. The classified databases she was accessing required authorization codes that shouldn't have been available to a logistics officer, but the crisis had rendered normal security protocols irrelevant. "I'm pulling up the personnel files for Operation Nightfall survivors," she announced, her voice carrying new authority as she embraced her revealed identity. Cross-referencing with known associates' financial records and psychological evaluations from their last fitness assessments. The data that appeared on her screen painted a grim picture. Marcus Viper Kowalski, former SAD operative discharged after psychological evaluation revealed concerning behavioral patterns. Last known location, Afghanistan, working as a private military contractor. Financial records showed recent large deposits from untraceable sources. "Kowalski was always unstable," Sarah said, her voice carrying the weight of personal knowledge. "Brilliant tactician, but he had issues with authority and civilian casualties. His discharge was classified to protect operational security, but it should have been dishonorable. The second profile was even more troubling. Elena Whisper Vasquez, former communications specialist for SAD, had disappeared from federal custody during a prisoner transport 6 months earlier. Her file indicated expertise in electronic warfare and infiltration, techniques that perfectly matched the capabilities being demonstrated by the attackers. Vasquez knows our communication protocols better than anyone, Sarah continued, her analysis becoming more urgent. She helped develop the encryption methods we're using right now. If she's leading this operation, she can probably hear every word we're saying. Lieutenant Colonel Chun immediately began issuing orders to switch to backup communication systems, but Sarah was already moving to the next phase of her analysis. Her fingers traced attack vectors on the tactical display, her mind processing the enemy's movements through the lens of operational experience that she had never been able to acknowledge. They're using the Gibraltar Protocol, but with modifications, she said, her voice taking on the clinical precision of a professional. Briefing. Kowalski always preferred close-quarters engagements, and Vasquez would have insisted on multiple extraction routes. Their primary assault will come from the north, but they'll have secondary teams positioned to exploit any gaps in our response. Intelligence she was providing was devastatingly accurate, but it was also revealing the full extent of her classified knowledge. Every tactical insight, every strategic analysis, every prediction about enemy behavior was building an irrefutable case that she possessed operational experience far beyond her official record. Major Sterling, who had spent months suspecting her of deception, now found himself relying on her expertise to coordinate the base's defense. Captain, what's their likely timeline for the primary assault? Sarah studied the tactical display, her mind automatically calculating approach times, defensive response patterns, and the psychological factors that would influence her former colleagues. Decision-making. 23 minutes, she said with startling precision. Kowalski will want to maintain psychological pressure without giving us time to fully reposition. Vasquez will be monitoring our communications to ensure we don't deviate from expected response patterns. The prediction proved accurate to the minute. At exactly 2:34 a.m., the base's perimeter alarms erupted as multiple teams began their coordinated assault on the secure facility. The attackers moved with the fluid precision of elite military units, their tactics demonstrating the kind of training that was available only to the most classified operatives. They're through the outer perimeter, Sergeant Morrison reported, his voice tight with tension. Moving in formation consistent with Special Operations assault protocols. Sarah was already anticipating the next phase of the attack. Her experience with similar operations allowed her to predict the enemy's movements with uncanny accuracy, but each prediction further exposed the classified nature of her background. The security team protecting the VIPs is using standard defensive positioning, she said, her voice carrying growing urgency. But Kowalski trained with those same protocols. He'll know exactly where they're positioned and how to neutralize them. Without waiting for orders, Sarah began coordinating defensive adjustments that went far beyond her official authority. Her commands were precise, tactical, and delivered with the confidence of someone accustomed to high-stakes operations. The other officers found themselves following her lead, recognizing expertise that transcended rank and protocol. Echo Team, adjust your position 15 degrees northwest, she spoke into the communication system. The attackers will be using night vision that gives them advantage in your current location. Foxtrot Team, prepare for quarters engagement. Standard Arrow E is suspended. These hostiles have military training and will exploit any hesitation. Colonel Blackwood watched in amazement as Sarah transformed the chaotic defensive response into a coordinated counter-operation. Her tactical adjustments were turning the attackers' advantages against them, using their own specialized training to predict and counter their movements. How is she doing this? Sterling whispered to Chun, his voice filled with awe and growing. "Respect, because she's not just an officer," Chun replied quietly. "She's one of them. She knows exactly what they're thinking because she's been trained to think the same way." The realization was spreading through the command center like wildfire. The woman they had dismissed and persecuted was revealing herself to be one of the most elite operatives in the American military, someone whose knowledge and experience were precisely what they needed to counter the threat they faced. But even as Sarah coordinated the defense with devastating effectiveness, she knew that her career was ending with each tactical decision she made. Every command she issued, every strategic insight she provided, every moment of revealed expertise was creating a paper trail that would be impossible to explain through conventional channels. The ghost of Operation Night Raven was fighting her final battle, not in some distant foreign land, but in defense of her own colleagues. The irony was not lost on her. She was using the very skills that had made her a target of suspicion to protect the people who had spent months trying to destroy her career. The woman who had chosen silence over vindication was now forced to speak with the voice of absolute authority, even though that voice would inevitably lead to her own destruction. The siege ended at dawn with the capture of both attackers and the safe evacuation of all Pentagon officials. Sarah's tactical brilliance had saved dozens of lives, but her cover was irreparably blown. As investigators descended on Fort Carson, she knew the reckoning was inevitable. 3 weeks later, Sarah sat in a Pentagon conference room facing a panel of senior officials. The charges against her were severe: unauthorized disclosure of classified information, violation of operational security protocols, and breach of her cover agreement. The evidence was overwhelming: dozens of witnesses, recorded communications, and tactical decisions that could only have come from someone with her specific background. "Captain Martinez," the lead investigator said, "you had multiple opportunities to request proper authorization before revealing classified information. Instead, you chose to expose operational secrets that took years to develop." Sarah's response was calm and unwavering. "I chose to save American lives using whatever means necessary. I accept full responsibility for my actions." The court-martial proceedings that followed were swift and decisive. Sarah was found guilty on all charges, stripped of her rank, and sentenced to dishonorable discharge. But as she walked out of the courtroom, she carried with her the knowledge that 23 people were alive because of her sacrifice. Colonel Blackwood, his own career destroyed by the investigation into his harassment campaign, watched from the gallery as the woman he had persecuted accepted her fate with the same dignity she had shown throughout months of systematic abuse. 5 years later, Sarah Martinez works as a private security consultant, her true identity still classified. But her reputation for excellence spreading through quiet professional networks. She had lost everything: rank, career, honor, but she had kept what mattered most: the knowledge that some sacrifices are worth making, even when the world will never know their true cost. What did you think of Sarah's ultimate sacrifice? Have you ever had to choose between personal success and doing what's right? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories of hidden heroes who changed everything.